We've been talking about Rosh Hashanah as the re-experiencing of creation. So creation the first time around happened with Hashem speaking, and Hashem said, let there be light and let there be whatever, and that's how the world came into existence. And Rosh Hashanah every single year is not just an anniversary and commemoration of what happened in the past, but much more than that, it is a reenactment of what happened in the past. And that's why it's so important for us to understand how the creation process works, because then we can understand what the energy of Rosh Hashanah is all about. So far, we've spoken about it just in the context of speech, that Hashem spoke, and that's how the world came into being. And we said that that implies two things. Firstly, it implies that it was a very minor investment on Hashem's part, because it doesn't take a huge amount of energy to speak. Secondly, that compared to everything Hashem could theoretically have said, and certainly compared to everything Hashem thinks, and certainly compared to Hashem himself, speaking a few lines is minuscule. And that's basically what we would need to understand, that what Hashem invested into the creation, even though to us, creation is so overwhelmingly powerful and beautiful and complex, for Hashem it's, so to speak, next to nothing. Where do we come into the picture? Because in order to speak, you have to have an audience. If you don't have an audience, why would you talk? And if the audience shows enthusiasm, then you want to give them more. And that's why on Rosh Hashanah we do all of these things to show Hashem how enthusiastic we are. So we said yesterday that we'd now link this into the theme of Hashem being a king. Because throughout the entire davening of Rosh Hashanah, and for that matter right through to Yom Kippur, there's a tremendous emphasis on this idea of a king. We change the davening. Instead of saying Hakel HaKadosh, we say HaMelech HaKadosh, that Hashem is this holy king. We speak about Avinu Malkeinu, and it is this consistent theme that keeps repeating itself throughout Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the theme of Hashem as a king. So what's the correlation between the two? So there's an expression that goes like this: Bidvar Melech Shilton. With the words, the king rules. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because ultimately, how is a king the king? How is the king the ruler? He speaks. He says, this is what we're going to do. These are the new edicts. These are the new rules. These are the new instructions. And that defines the reality of everybody who lives in the kingdom. So immediately we can see that there is an association between the concept of a king, or for that matter, any leadership, and the concept of speech. Think about it. You could be the most incredible leader that exists, and some of our kings in history were the most incredible people that existed. But if you don't have language, and you can't convey to people what you need, or what you want, or what your vision is, then you're an ineffective king. So the king's role is not a natural extension of the king's abilities. Interesting, right? The king could have tremendous abilities, but until such time as the king communicates what's going on the inside, he's not really a king. So why do we appoint somebody to be a leader? Why do we want somebody to be our king? Because we recognize that they have greatness. They have a very developed intellect. They are very compassionate. They're very spiritual. Whatever the particular values are that we want to see in a leader, that's why we appoint a particular person to be a leader. But just because they've been appointed as a leader does not yet tell us that we're going to get anything from them. They now have to find a language. They've got to find a way to express what their greatness is and to share it with us. So a strong leader is a good communicator. Because if you can communicate effectively, you can get the people to join you on your journey that you as a leader would want to take them on. Now, in the same way as we've already identified that there's no point in speaking if there's no audience, by the same token, there's no point in being a leader if nobody's willing to follow. It's the same principle. So that's why there's this very strong correlation between the experience of conversation, communication, and the concept of being a king. Both of them, although the person who is the leader or the person who is the teacher, the communicator, has all the resources, I've got the information, I've got the knowledge, I've got the insight, I've got the vision, actually the audience has the power. It's interesting, right? Just because I have everything to share does not automatically mean that I have the power, because if you don't want to hear what I have to share, then I am sterile. So the king could have the most magnificent vision, could be the most brilliant person around, but if nobody is willing to follow the king, then that's just wasted potential. But he's impotent. He cannot do anything. He can't stimulate the people. He can't drive the people because they're not interested. So the king has all of the resources, yet the people have all of the power. And that's why we have an expression that the sages use, Ein melech beloi am. There's no such thing as a king without a nation, for obvious reasons. Because, you know what they say in Yiddish? By your mother, you're a king. Okay, thank you very much. But in real life, you're nothing if nobody's willing to follow you. So there's a very interesting relationship that exists between the king with all of his greatness and the people, whether or not the people are open to let the king guide them. Then he becomes a king. Now here's something very interesting about this king/leader, in whichever form the leader might be. Very interesting. And before we get to what that is, let's go back for a moment to the speaker and the audience, because it will help. Sometimes a person has a story that they've never told before. And somebody says, you know, maybe you should share your story. It's quite an inspiring story. Maybe you should share it. And they're very self-conscious. And I don't know if I should say it. And I don't know if I can convey it properly. And I'm not sure if people will appreciate it. And they're very careful and reticent. And they don't really want to rush into this. But they get pushed. And eventually comes the opportunity. And they get up and they start to tell this particular story. And they don't know what to expect from the audience. In other words, in their mind, as they begin to share their story, they do so with a tremendous degree of self-doubt. I don't know if it's going to be meaningful for people. I don't know if it will interest people. I don't know if they'll learn anything from it. Maybe I'll just embarrass myself. Then they tell the story once and they get this overwhelming response. People are, wow, you really need to tell more people your story. It's so inspiring. It's so uplifting. So now they shift fundamentally from being somebody who was nervous and reticent to somebody who realizes, I'm actually a speaker. I actually have something to share. And it could well be that that one experience becomes the catalyst for a whole shift in how they live their life. Instead of just being an ordinary person, now they go out motivating, inspiring people because they've recognized that they have the ability to speak. So again, the audience gave them the power. They had the resource. They had the story. They had the information. But the audience gave them the power that now they want to go tell the story again. A similar kind of thing happens with leaders, real leaders. You get two kinds of people in the world in leadership. You get people who want to be leaders and you get people who should be leaders. And they're not always the same people. In fact, maybe that's one of the flaws of the democratic system, is that leaders very often are the people who want to be leaders. And then they convince the electorate to elect them as leaders, but they're not necessarily the people who should be leaders. Whereas the people who should be leaders very often don't want to be leaders, and that's why they don't follow a career in politics, because they don't want to be leaders. And often a person who doesn't want to be a leader, it's not because they doubt themselves, not because they don't believe that they have what to offer. It's just because they've never been stimulated into a leadership position. Just like this individual who has a really moving story. It is a real story. It's moving. It's powerful. But they've never been given the taste of what it is to share that story and see the reaction and the inspiration in people's eyes. Once they see it, once they're exposed to that, suddenly they realize, okay, this is what I should be doing. And by the same token, similar to what the expression is in Pirkei Avos, if you look around and you see that there are no people, you should be that person. In other words, a person has to be aware enough of the fact that I actually do have something to contribute. I actually do have something to give. So if you have a look historically in the greatest Jewish leaders in our history, right up until the modern age, generally shied away from leadership positions. It's very interesting, whether it was Moshe, whether it was King David, all the way up to, like I say, if you look at the history of the Rebbe not wanting to take the position, a very contemporary example. So it's interesting how Jewish leadership generally has shied away from the leadership position. And they have to be coaxed into it. And one of the ways that they're coaxed into it is the people have to indicate to the leader, we would like to follow you. We would like you to be our leader. That's the principle of appointing a king. The Torah tells us there's a mitzvah, soim tosim olecha melech, that you have to appoint a king. That means to say you have to identify an individual who is suited to the position, and then you as the community have the responsibility to push them into the position, because that individual may very well not want the position or may feel inadequate for the position. So the nature of a melech, of a king, is not to naturally step up to the leadership position until such time as there's a groundswell of interest to say, we want you as our king. So in Moshe's case, Hashem pushes him from the top. In King David's case, the people appoint him from the bottom. They walk around campaigning, Yechi HaMelech, let King David be our king, over a period of 7 years actually, till eventually he takes the position. And so it is in many other occasions throughout the course of history. So when we talk about the creation of the world and its reenactment every year on Rosh Hashanah, those two themes coalesce. If you want Hashem to speak, you have to be willing to listen. So by extension, if you want Hashem to be your leader, your king, you have to be willing to commit yourself to be his subject. And that's the dynamic of Rosh Hashanah. Hashem is about to, so to speak, recreate the world, because it's a recurring event. Like all other spiritual events on the calendar, they don't commemorate the past, they reenact themselves each year. So Hashem's about to recreate the world. So now he has the resources, the power to create, but we as the audience have the power to make him king. In other words, to stimulate how much he's going to put into this world for the coming year. So both from a perspective of speech and from a perspective of king, it comes back to the same theme. We have to place Hashem, so to speak, as our king in order for it all to work. So tomorrow, please God, what we have to look at is, so how does that work? What are we supposed to do? And that may actually in itself be in two parts. Let's see how it all pans out.